In the winter of 1859, the Ozark Mountains of Missouri lay under a shroud of ice and silence. Snow piled thick along the ridges, isolating scattered cabins like islands lost in a frozen sea. For most frontier families, these months meant simple survival cutting wood, rationing food, and praying that sickness would pass them by. But for one German physician named Dr. Ernst Vogler, this desolate season would mark the beginning of the most horrifying discovery of his career, one that challenged not only medical science, but the very boundaries of morality and faith. Vogler had arrived in the United States less than 5 years earlier, carrying the reputation of a brilliant yet controversial academic. Trained in Berlin and Vienna, he had written essays on heredity that unsettled his colleagues, speculating that certain human traits diseased deformity. Even temperament could pass predictably through bloodlines. In Europe, his suggestions had been dismissed as unorthodox. In Missouri, a land teetering between civilization and wilderness, his ideas found fertile ground. He became known as a frontier doctor unafraid to confront strange ailments, the kind others preferred to bury in silence. It was during a supply run through the Ozarks that Vogler first heard whispers of a peculiar family living 20 miles from the nearest settlement. A mail carrier spoke of them in hushed tones, the Kavanaghs, recent immigrants from Ireland who had purchased an isolated tract of land high in the mountains. The carrier claimed they were unlike other settlers, pale, uniform in appearance, speaking Gaelic among themselves, their children eerily obedient and distant. But it wasn't their manners that disturbed him. It was the graves. Behind their cabin, he had counted 5 small crosses of fresh wood, each too small to belong to a grown body. At first, Vogler dismissed it as the tragic reality of frontier life. Infant mortality was common. Winters in the Ozarks killed indiscriminately. Yet something in the carrier's tone lingered an unease not born from sympathy but from fear. He spoke of sounds in the night crying that seemed to last for hours, then cease as if extinguished. He spoke of songs, strange hymns that drifted across the snow, sung in voices that seemed too low, too mournful, too wrong. Curiosity overcame caution. When February brought a brief thaw in the passes, Vogler rode into the mountains with little more than his medical kit, a lantern, and a notebook. The journey was brutal. Frozen streams cracked beneath his horse's hooves, and the skeletal trees groaned under the weight of snow. By dusk, he saw smoke rising from a narrow valley, where a solitary cabin stood framed against the white. From a distance, it looked unremarkable, neat, sturdy, the kind any hard-working family might build. But as Vogler drew closer, his trained eyes noted unsettling details, shutters nailed shut, chimneys burning too hot for ordinary fires, and a faint stench beneath the wood smoke, sweet and sickly, that prickled his instincts. He dismounted and approached. The door opened before he could knock. A man stood there, Patrick Kavanagh, broad-shouldered. His hair already gray, though he looked scarcely 40. His eyes, pale blue and unblinking, fixed on Vogler with an intensity that bordered on hostility. For a moment neither spoke. Then Patrick forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "We don't need a doctor," he said, his accent heavy with Ireland's southern coast. Vogler replied with the measured politeness of a man accustomed to suspicion. He explained that he was traveling to check on remote settlers, offering his services where needed. Behind Patrick, shadows stirred. A woman appeared thin, hollow-cheeked, her shawl clutched tight as if against some private chill. Her gaze darted from Patrick to Vogler, then to the ground, as though silence had been drilled into her very bones. It was then that Vogler noticed the children. 3 of them, standing in the dim light of the cabin, watching him with an unnatural stillness. Their features were eerily similar: sharp cheekbones, long fingers, pale eyes that mirrored their father's. They did not fidget, did not whisper among themselves as children usually did. They simply stared. Patrick finally allowed the doctor inside, but only briefly. The cabin was too orderly, too calculated. Heavy curtains divided the interior into separate chambers. Strange tools, neither wholly medical nor wholly domestic, lay neatly arranged on a shelf, and in one corner, Vogler glimpsed a wooden box sealed with wax, its surface stained dark. He said nothing, but his mind raced. Years of studying families in remote European villages had taught him to recognize patterns of inbreeding uniform features, nervous afflictions, deformities whispered about but rarely shown to outsiders. Here, in the Ozarks, those same signs stared him in the face. The visit was short. Patrick made it clear no outsiders were welcome. Yet, as Vogler left, he passed behind the cabin and saw what the mail carrier had described small graves, 11 in a row, the earth disturbed too recently, the crosses uniform, as if carved in batches. He bent close to one and brushed snow from the wood. The inscription was crude but legible: Infans, June 1858. Another read: Infans, October 1858. The spacing was deliberate. These were not random tragedies. They were patterns. That night, alone in a wayside shelter, Vogler wrote in his journal, "These deaths are not the work of nature alone. There's calculation here, perhaps ritual. The family speaks of purity. I must return, but with caution. What I glimpsed today may be evidence of practices older and darker than science dares to name." The physician could not have known then that his discovery was only the surface of a far deeper horror, one rooted in Irish soil a generation earlier, nurtured by twisted theology and transplanted into the heart of America's wilderness. The Kavanagh family's obsession with bloodlines was no accident of frontier survival. It was a deliberate experiment, spanning continents and generations, in pursuit of a purity that would demand sacrifice beyond imagining. And it was only beginning to unravel. To understand the horror that surfaced in the Missouri Ozarks during 1859, one must trace its roots back to Ireland, an island already soaked in famine, faith, and blood. The Kavanagh family's story did not begin in the American frontier. It began in the winter of 1790 in a remote parish of County Kerry, where famine had sharpened desperation, and the church's shadow left little room for questioning. The patriarch of the bloodline, Seamus Kavanagh, was not a poor tenant farmer like his neighbors. Unlike most Irish peasants, Seamus had books. He had traveled to Dublin as a young man and returned with ideas that unsettled those who knew him. He spoke of select breeding as if people were no different than cattle or sheep. His father had raised prized horses for an Anglo-Irish landlord, and Seamus had seen how careful pairings produced animals stronger, faster, and more valuable. The same, he whispered to his kin, could be done with us. The 1790s in Ireland were a time of upheaval. Rebellion stirred against British rule. Famine stalked the countryside, and priests thundered against sins that might draw God's wrath. Families clung to one another, their survival dependent on blood ties. It was in this climate of fear and hunger that the Kavanaghs began to look inward literally. Instead of allowing their children to marry outside the family, they encouraged marriages between cousins, insisting it was both God's will and a safeguard against outsiders who might dilute their strength. The justification was disturbingly religious. Seamus cited Scripture, pointing to Old Testament genealogies where patriarchs married within their kin. He told his children that God had chosen blood purity as a mark of favor, and that their line carried a divine responsibility. But beneath the sermons lay something far colder, an obsession with control. By keeping marriages within the family, Seamus ensured land, cattle, and influence never slipped away into other hands. What began as whispers of Scripture soon hardened into law within the household: the blood must remain pure. By the turn of the century, The results of this belief had already begun to show. Some Kavanagh children were striking tall, pale, unnervingly intelligent, with piercing blue eyes that neighbors called the witch's gaze. Others were born twisted, their limbs malformed, their minds clouded. These infants disappeared quickly, excused as victims of the harsh winters, buried without ceremony in the family plot. When asked, Seamus would only say, "The Lord takes whom he will." Few dared challenge him. But the parish priest of Kilgarvan, Father Aidan Murphy, eventually noticed patterns too grave to ignore. Baptism records vanished, burials went unreported. He pressed Seamus one evening after Mass, warning him that the rumors of dark practices could bring scandal. Seamus's reply chilled him. "Our ways are older than Rome. We protect what is ours. Father, do not trespass where you do not belong." In time, the whispers spread. Villagers claimed they heard cries in the night cut short by sudden silence. They claimed to see young cousins kept too close, eyes watching each other with something less than innocence. More than once, midwives who attended Kavanagh births left pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. By 1805, the scandal could no longer be contained. Father Murphy, usually discreet, delivered a fiery sermon denouncing abominations in God's sight. Though he never named the family, all knew his target. The Kavanaghs faced open hostility. Stones shattered their windows. Fields were set ablaze. And yet, the family did not break. They withdrew further, shuttering themselves inside their home, venturing out only under cover of night. It was during this time that the first leather-bound journal appeared, written in Seamus's careful hand. Preserved decades later in Missouri, Dr. Vogler would examine its cracked pages and find drawings of infants, some beautiful, some grotesque, annotated with phrases like strength of jaw, weak lungs, or unsuitable for life. The notes revealed that by the early 1800s, the Kavanaghs had already systematized their practices. What had begun as whispered superstition was becoming a deliberate program. When Seamus died in 1812, his eldest son Padraig assumed leadership. Unlike his father, Padraig cloaked the family's practices in pseudoscience. He had encountered traveling physicians during the Napoleonic Wars and absorbed fragments of emerging ideas about heredity. He blended these with scripture, convincing his siblings and cousins that their experiment was not only God's will, but also the future of Ireland itself. While others starve, he declared, "We will breed strength. When the English are gone, our blood will rule this land." But the toll grew heavier. More infants were buried. Cousin married cousin, generation upon generation, until the faces of the Kavanaghs became eerily uniform, sharp, angular, ghostly pale. Villagers whispered that they could no longer tell one child from another. By the 1820s, the family had become pariahs, accused of witchcraft by some, shunned by nearly all. Finally, in 1831, the church intervened. A visiting bishop, hearing rumors of monstrous births, ordered an inquiry. The Kavanaghs were threatened with excommunication unless they ceased their unnatural unions. Instead of obeying, they fled. Some scattered across Ireland, adopting new names. But one branch, led by Patrick Kavanagh, Padraig's grandson, set their eyes on America, a land vast enough to hide, wild enough to tolerate secrets, and far removed from clerical oversight. They sailed from Cork to New York under falsified names in 1856, carrying with them gold coins, forged papers, and at least one trunk of journals documenting decades of breeding records. From New York, they vanished into the interior, leaving behind only a note in an immigration inspector's ledger, "Children appear peculiar, recommended further observation." That observation never came. The wave of immigrants was too great, the system too overwhelmed. The Kavanaghs slipped through. By 1857, they had purchased land deep in the Missouri Ozarks, land no neighbor could see. land where snow cut off all passage for half the year. There, Patrick and his kin would continue the experiment, far from the prying eyes of priests and villagers, yet bound to the same doctrine that had taken root in the windswept hills of Kerry nearly 70 years earlier. What had begun as a twisted interpretation of Scripture in a famine-stricken parish had now crossed an ocean. In America, the Kavanaghs would refine it into something colder, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. The Missouri Ozarks of the mid-19th century were a paradox of rugged beauty and crushing isolation. The land rolled in endless ridges, oak and hickory forests broken only by rocky clearings and winding creeks that flooded in spring and froze solid in winter. Settlers who ventured into this wilderness often did so to escape something: debts, law, or memories too heavy to carry into civilized towns. It was here, in 1857, that the Kavanagh family vanished into the folds of the mountains, bringing with them traditions older than America itself. At first glance, the Ozarks seemed the perfect refuge. The federal government's presence was weak. Its deputies scattered thinly across hundreds of square miles. In the mining camps, violence was common, and a missing family would scarcely raise a whisper. Winter storms sealed valleys for months, cutting communities into islands adrift from one another. To most frontier families, such isolation was a danger. To the Kavanaghs, it was a gift. The Kavanaghs arrived in Greene County, Missouri, by wagon. Local merchants remembered them because they were unlike the usual ragged immigrants. They paid for goods exclusively with gold coins marked with Irish and Spanish mints, worn from years of handling. Their patriarch, Patrick Kavanagh, spoke with the Polish of a man educated far beyond the ordinary farmer. His hands bore the stains of ink rather than soil, and his gaze held a calculating steadiness that unnerved even seasoned traders. Patrick explained that they had come seeking fresh land after the famine had ruined their farms in Ireland. It was a familiar story, one told by thousands of Irish immigrants, yet something about it rang false. His wife, Bridget, seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse, her frame thin, her voice a whisper. She clutched her children with such intensity that even in public they stood pressed against her, as though separation would invite disaster. The children themselves unsettled observers the most. There were 4 of them: Michael, aged 18, Moira, 16, Nora, 14, and young Liam, barely 11. Their resemblance to one another was uncanny, as though each face had been stamped from the same mold. They possessed the same hollow blue eyes, the same elongated fingers, the same angular jaw. Strangers often glanced twice, unsettled by how unnatural their uniformity appeared. Rumors spread quickly. The blacksmith's wife swore she heard the children conversing in Gaelic about keeping the line strong. A schoolteacher in Springfield, who briefly tutored Michael in mathematics, described the boy as frighteningly intelligent yet unnervingly cold, memorizing entire texts in days but showing no curiosity beyond what was demanded of him. Within months, the Kavanaghs purchased a 160-acre tract of mountain land, far from neighbors, accessible only by a narrow trail that became impassable each winter. The land was poor for farming, but its isolation was absolute. There, they constructed a cabin unlike the crude shelters of most settlers. Its walls were thick, its windows small, and its interior divided by heavy partitions that suggested secrecy rather than comfort. Behind it, a clearing was marked by rows of earth that, even in their first season, seemed prepared for more than just crops. The Ozarks, meanwhile, remained a land in flux. The gold fever that had briefly swept through the region was fading, leaving behind desperate men willing to steal, kill, or vanish. Supply lines stretched thin, and doctors were rare. In such an environment, the Kavanaghs could live as they pleased, answering to no one but themselves. and in their solitude they began to resurrect the same practices that had once driven them from Ireland. Travelers who passed near their homestead in 1858 reported disturbing signs. Smoke rose at odd hours of night, too much for cooking, too frequent for simple warmth. Strange songs in a language few recognized drifted across the frozen air, melodies harsh, discordant, carrying tones that seemed more like incantations than hymns. Hunters swore they saw figures moving through snowstorms, tall shapes that walked with awkward, halting gaits, as though their bodies resisted their own movements. By spring, whispers circulated in Springfield and the surrounding towns. The mail carrier, one of the few who dared the mountain trail, described visiting the cabin and smelling a sweetness beneath the wood smoke, a smell he recognized as death. He noted children too quiet, too submissive, their eyes darting to their father before answering even simple questions. When asked about the graves behind the cabin, Patrick brushed the matter aside. "Winter takes the week," he said, his voice measured, final. Yet the graves seemed too many, too neatly ordered. Each cross bore dates only months apart, carved with uniform strokes. Neighbors could not help but wonder if the family had prepared for death rather than mourned it. Isolation, for most, broke minds. Men went mad with loneliness. Women despaired under endless labor, but the Kavanaghs thrived in silence. They preserved meat with uncanny precision, grew crops unsuited to the soil yet coaxed them into life, and calculated rations with mathematical care. It was as if they had prepared for this exact life long before reaching Missouri, as if they had chosen the Ozarks not out of necessity, but design. For Dr. Vogler, hearing these accounts stirred both dread and fascination. He knew too well the consequences of families intermarrying in remote villages of Europe. He had seen children born with twisted spines, strange afflictions passed down through cousins and uncles. Yet here, in Missouri, the phenomenon seemed deliberate, as though the Kavanaghs were not victims of circumstance, but architects of their own fate. What no outsider yet realized was that beneath the cabin's floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay journals spanning generations. Within them, crude but meticulous records cataloged births, deaths, and the precise qualities of each child. Blue eyes, sharp jaw, steady temperament marked as worthy, curved spine, cleft palate, weak lungs marked as unfit. Each entry was not a memorial but an evaluation. The Ozarks, with their silence and distance, had provided the perfect stage for the next chapter of this grim experiment. And as the family prepared for another long winter, the line between survival and ritual would vanish entirely. By the autumn of 1857, the Kavanaghs had fully settled into the Ozarks. Their journey from New York to Missouri had left little trace, only a handful of forged documents and Ellis Island records, and vague reports from riverboat captains who recalled a pale Irish family traveling south with trunks heavy enough to strain the crew. For all appearances, they were immigrants like thousands of others. But the closer one looked, the less ordinary they seemed. In Springfield, the county seat, the land office recorded Patrick Kavanagh's purchase of 160 acres in the mountains. The deed was paid in gold, unusual but not unheard of in a region where miners often carried such currency. Yet the officials noticed something odd. Patrick's papers claimed he had lived in Brooklyn for 3 years prior to his westward journey, complete with employment records and references. The signatures were flawless, the seals official-looking, but the handwriting of the references bore a suspicious similarity, and the names themselves appeared nowhere else in city directories. The forgery was masterful, but it was still a forgery. Local merchants recalled their arrival vividly. Bridget Kavanagh, Patrick's wife, spoke in little more than whispers, her hands trembling as though from some unseen affliction. She rarely lifted her eyes from the floor and counted each coin 3 or 4 times before releasing it. More than one shopkeeper swore she looked over her shoulder constantly, as though expecting to be dragged back into some nightmare she had fled. The children, too, unnerved those who met them. Michael, tall and severe for his 18 years, never laughed and spoke only when prompted by his father. Moira, 16, carried herself with the weariness of a grown woman, her eyes hollow yet sharp. Nora, only 14, worked with a precision far beyond her age, arranging goods in patterns too neat, too deliberate. And young Liam, though just 11, repeated phrases his father used purity of the line, strength in blood with a seriousness that no child should possess. Neighbors noticed the strange resemblance between them all. It went beyond the ordinary traits of siblings. Their pale blue eyes seemed identical in shade. Their angular faces mirror images of one another, their hands long and thin, with joints too flexible. It was as if the children were variations on a single theme, rather than individuals born of chance. When asked about their past, Patrick offered a simple narrative famine had driven them from Ireland. They were potato farmers ruined by blight, seeking a fresh start in the land of opportunity. Yet his hands bore none of the calluses of a farmer. Instead, they were ink-stained, the hands of a man accustomed to writing, tallying, recording. When pressed, he shifted the story smoothly, weaving details that sounded plausible but never fully consistent. In Springfield's taverns, rumors began to circulate. A teamster claimed he saw Patrick poring over old books in the back room of a supply store, books on physiology and natural history, far removed from farming manuals. A midwife swore Bridget avoided her gaze, as though fearful of questions about childbirth, and the mail carrier, who made the arduous trek to the mountain homestead once a month, returned with unsettling stories. The family conversed in Gaelic, but even when they spoke English, their talk centered on the line, the strength of the blood and sacrifices. Their homestead itself deepened suspicion. Most immigrant families built cabins with open interiors, 1 or 2 rooms, enough for cooking, sleeping, and surviving. But the Kavanagh cabin was different. Its walls were unusually thick, the windows narrow, and its interior divided into sections sealed by heavy curtains. The cellar was larger than necessary, its walls lined with shelves and sealed crates. Visitors noted the faint odor of chemicals, lye, vinegar, and something metallic that suggested preservation, not simple housekeeping. Behind the cabin stretched a small clearing where wooden crosses stood in a row. The graves were too many for one family's misfortune, their spacing too uniform to be natural. Some bore dates mere months apart. Others were unmarked, their wood already graying. When asked, Patrick shrugged them off. "The weak don't last in this wilderness," he said. "Better they return to God quickly." The words were delivered without grief, only with the finality of a man repeating a practiced phrase. More troubling still was the family's relationship with the church. Catholic immigrants in Missouri often sought community through parish life, but the Kavanaghs never appeared at Mass. When the local priest visited their homestead to offer blessings, Patrick met him at the door with stiff courtesy, never allowing him inside. Bridget avoided the priest's eyes entirely, while the children stood silently, their faces unreadable. The priest later confided to townsfolk that he felt as though he had stepped into a house where prayers were not welcomed, but feared. By 1858, the Kavanaghs had become a subject of whispered conversation. Some dismissed them as merely eccentric, perhaps traumatized by famine and exile. But others whispered darker things, that they were not farmers at all, but fugitives from scandal, that their gold was stolen, that their children were born of unnatural unions. The most disturbing rumor came from a hunter who claimed he passed their cabin one night and heard the cries of an infant suddenly cut off, followed by silence too heavy to mistake. For Dr. Vogler, These accounts carried the weight of patterns he had studied before. In villages of Saxony and Bavaria, he had seen families who married within bloodlines for generations, producing both brilliance and madness. But the Kavanaghs were not victims of isolation, they had chosen it. They had arrived with forged documents, prepared graves, and rituals already practiced. The Ozarks were not their misfortune, they were their design. And soon, as winter deepened and the passes closed, their design would reveal its true nature. By the early months of 1858, the rumors surrounding the Kavanagh homestead had shifted from whispers of eccentricity to murmurs of dread. Frontier life was filled with hardship, and families often lost infants to fever or the cruel cold. But with the Kavanaghs, the pattern was too neat, too frequent, too calculated to be dismissed as tragedy. It was the mail carrier, a man hardened by years of riding treacherous trails, who first spoke openly. On his March delivery, he claimed to have heard the unmistakable cries of an infant as he approached the cabin. The sound carried across the still winter air, fragile but insistent. Yet, as he drew near, the wailing cut off abruptly, unnaturally, as though a hand had smothered it mid-breath. When he reached the door, Bridget Kavanagh appeared pale, trembling, and insisted all was well. But her voice cracked, and her hands were flecked with something darker than wood ash. The carrier was not the only one to notice. A hunter passing through the valley reported strange activity at dusk, shadows digging behind the cabin. Even as snow fell heavy, the ground nearly frozen solid. The next time he passed, he saw a fresh wooden cross planted in the earth, identical to the others. Its inscription marked simply infans. January 1858. By spring thaw, there were 4 new graves, each too small to hold a grown body. Their crosses stood in a neat row, carved from the same timber, their inscriptions uniform as if prepared in advance. Seasoned frontier families mourned each loss with hand-carved tributes, different in size, style, and detail. But the Kavanaghs' markers were cold, clinical, standardized. It gave the impression not of grief, but of record-keeping. Villagers in Springfield began to share their suspicions. One woman recalled encountering young Moira, then 17, at the trading post. Moira's eyes were bloodshot, her hands raw from washing. When asked casually about her siblings, she whispered, "Some don't stay. Father says God only wants the strong ones." Then, realizing she had spoken aloud, she went rigid, clamped her lips shut, and fled the store. More unsettling still were the accounts of the songs. Hunters swore that at night they heard low voices carrying through the trees, chanting in Gaelic. The melodies were wrong minor keys that twisted upward, cadences that ended in dissonance. They sounded like hymns, yet not of the church. Those who listened long enough said the voices sometimes broke into sobbing, only to resume the chant as if nothing had changed. The Kavanagh children themselves grew increasingly strange in the eyes of outsiders. Michael, barely 19, carried himself like a man twice his age, always watching, rarely speaking. Nora and Moira obeyed their father with absolute silence, their eyes flinching at even the smallest command. Young Liam, once bright-eyed, was seen staring at the row of graves behind the cabin. A neighbor later claimed to have heard him whisper, "Some babies aren't meant to be. Father says we must send them back. But sometimes, I think it isn't God who decides." The story might have ended there, written off as another tale of frontier hardship, had it not been for what the mail carrier found in late spring 1858. Arriving with government correspondence, he was greeted not by Patrick but by Bridget Ashen, exhausted, her shawl stained. Behind her, in the dim light of the cabin, he glimpsed a scene that haunted him for years. A birthing bed, hastily arranged, a teenage girl, Moira, acting as midwife, and in Bridget's arms, a newborn child whose body was unmistakably malformed, a curved spine bending grotesquely, a clubbed hand with fused fingers, a head disproportionate, its cries weak but persistent. The family's reaction, he recalled, was not grief or panic, it was calculation. Patrick's pale eyes assessed the child with clinical detachment, his lips moving in Gaelic as if reciting procedure. When the carrier offered to ride to Springfield for a doctor, Patrick fixed him with a stare that froze him in place. We handle our own troubles. To interfere with God's judgment is a sin. 2 weeks later, when the carrier returned, the infant was gone. Bridget met him at the door, her voice flat, her eyes dry. Lost the baby 3 days after you left. Buried him behind the cabin with the others. She gestured toward the graves, her tone devoid of mourning. What chilled the carrier most was her choice of words, with the others. That summer, as hunters, traders, and neighbors passed through the valley, they began to watch the Kavanaghs more closely. The children moved like people under constant threat, cautious, deliberate, avoiding errors. Michael stuttered when questioned about family life, stopping mid-sentence as if remembering the consequences of speaking. Nora avoided strangers entirely, her gaze fixed on the ground. Moira, though only 17, carried herself like a woman broken by secrets far too heavy for her age. The graves behind the cabin multiplied. By the end of 1858, there were 9 crosses, all small, all uniform. Too many to be chance, too ordered to be natural. Experienced woodsmen noted that the soil had been turned with haste, the kind of hurried digging done by those more concerned with concealment than reverence. To outsiders, the explanation was grimly simple: the Kavanaghs were cursed. Some whispered of witchcraft. Others believed their bloodline carried a sickness God himself had marked. But Dr. Vogler, piecing together these scattered reports, saw something far more deliberate. This was not the chaos of tragedy, but the order of a program, a methodical pattern of selection, of elimination, of keeping only what conformed to a twisted ideal. By winter's return, fear kept most neighbors from venturing near the Kavanagh homestead. The valley fell silent again, save for the occasional wail in the night and the distant echo of chants carried on the icy wind, and for Vogler, preparing his own journey deeper into the Ozarks. The question had shifted from what the Kavanaghs were doing to why. The winter of 1858 into 1859 swallowed the Ozarks in silence. Snow fell so heavily that mountain trails vanished for months, cutting families off from one another, leaving only smoke in the distance to mark where a hearth still burned. For most settlers, isolation was misery, but for the Kavanaghs, it was cover time to continue their rituals unseen. Travelers who dared skirt the ridges during that season brought back unsettling reports. A trapper swore he heard voices carried on the wind, chanting in Irish Gaelic, layered in a harmony so strange it seemed meant for throats shaped differently from human ones. A hunter claimed he glimpsed figures outside the cabin in the midst of a blizzard, moving tall and stiff through the snow as though indifferent to the cold. Others spoke of lights glowing at midnight, not the warm flicker of hearth flames, but an eerie, sustained brightness, as if lanterns had been set in every room. Most frontier families conserved fuel, hoarding every scrap of wood against starvation. Yet the Kavanaghs seemed to burn through the night, their chimney exhaling strange plumes that smelled of resin and chemicals. One man said he caught the odor of scorched cloth, another swore it was closer to bone. None stayed long enough to find out. By the end of that winter, whispers turned to warnings: avoid the valley, avoid the family, for something there was unholy. But where others saw evil, doctor. Ernst Vogler saw a puzzle. In Springfield, he listened carefully to the hunters, trappers, and mail carrier, piecing together patterns that matched too closely to what he had studied in Europe. Vogler knew the consequences of inbreeding in isolated communities. In Saxony, he had examined entire hamlets where cousin married cousin, producing both prodigies and cripples. He had written about it years earlier, arguing that heredity shaped the human body as surely as soil shaped crops. For that, he had been ridiculed. But the reports from the Ozarks suggested something far worse than accident deliberation. Unable to reach the cabin during the snowbound months, Vogler turned to records. He combed through immigration logs in New York, tracing the Kavanaghs' arrival in 1856. What he found disturbed him deeply. An inspector at Ellis Island had noted peculiar physical traits among children, recommending further examination. But the family had produced papers too perfect to challenge. And with thousands flooding through daily, the warning was ignored. Cross-referencing further, Vogler discovered more fragments. A Kavanagh family in Pennsylvania investigated in 1853 for unusual infant mortality. Another in Ohio, 1855, accused of neglect when several children disappeared suddenly, though no charges were filed. In both cases, the families vanished overnight, leaving no forwarding address. It was no coincidence. The Missouri branch had not simply fled Ireland, they had followed a pattern across America, moving west whenever suspicion grew too sharp. Vogler began to suspect he was not facing an isolated case of madness, but part of a larger network of kin, bound by ritual, scattered yet connected by the same obsession, blood purity. The implications gnawed at him. If multiple branches of the family had carried the same practices across states, how many graves lay hidden, unmarked? In forests and farm fields, how many children had vanished without their deaths ever recorded? Spring came late to the Ozarks in 1859, but when the mountain passes finally thawed, Vogler prepared to act. He resolved to visit the Kavanagh homestead under the guise of routine medical service, yet his notebook from that season betrays his deeper motives. In one entry, written in a tight German hand, he confessed, "This is no mere curiosity. I believe the Kavanaghs conduct deliberate experiments upon their own lineage. They do not suffer from the randomness of heredity, they cultivate it, like breeders of livestock. The graves are not tragedies, but selections. If true, this is the most systematic and horrific application of bloodline theory I have yet encountered. I must see it with my own eyes, even if it condemns me." In the valleys, meanwhile, the rumors only darkened. A trapper returning from the mountains in March claimed he heard a sound that still made his skin crawl, crying, high-pitched, sustained for hours, then cut off in an instant. He swore it was not one child, but several, their voices overlapping, then silenced all at once. Others reported seeing Patrick himself in town briefly that spring. His hair shockingly whitened, his frame stooped, though he could not have been past 40. He bought supplies in bulk lye, vinegar, cloth, and strange instruments from the blacksmith, then returned to the mountains without another word. Whatever was happening in that cabin, it had escalated. And when the snow cleared, Vogler would finally confront it. The thaw of spring 1859 opened the mountain trails once more, and with it came Ernst Vogler's chance to see the Kavanagh homestead for himself. The journey was grueling. The path wound upward through dense forests, across streams swollen with meltwater, and over ridges still capped with snow. By the time he reached the narrow valley, dusk was falling, and smoke curled from the chimney of a cabin that looked, at first glance, ordinary. Yet Vogler knew better than to trust appearances. As he dismounted, his eyes were drawn immediately to the cemetery behind the house. 11 wooden crosses stood in 2 neat rows, their proportions identical. Their inscriptions chillingly uniform infants. A month here, a month there. The pattern was unmistakable. These were not random tragedies. They were calculated intervals, as though the family had scheduled death itself. Freshly disturbed soil near the edge of the plot suggested more graves were being prepared, awaiting occupants not yet born. Patrick Kavanagh greeted him at the door. His once dark hair was now streaked fully white, his eyes sunken but burning with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. "Doctor," he said with forced civility, "we have always managed our own troubles. But since you've come this far, you may take a look." The words were not welcome but challenge. Inside. Vogler found the cabin divided by heavy curtains and locked doors, more like a warren than a family dwelling. The air was thick with the smells of vinegar, smoke, and something faintly metallic. Shelves held jars of preserved herbs and strange fluids, while crude instruments of medical, some unidentifiable, gleamed in the dim light. It was not a home. It was a workshop. Then there were the children. Michael, the eldest, now 19, stood tall yet unnervingly rigid. His stutter emerged only when his father entered the room, his words catching in his throat as though fear strangled them before they left his lips. Moira, 17, appeared withdrawn, her gaze never meeting Vogler's eyes. Her hands trembled as she worked at sewing cloth, though the stitches were immaculate. Nora, only 15, moved silently, her body already showing signs of unnatural maturity, hips and breasts developed beyond her years. Her eyes sunken with the knowledge she should not yet possess, and Liam, barely 12, bore the most visible marks, one leg curved at the shin, forcing a limp, his fingers unnaturally long and flexible, his face asymmetrical. Vogler's trained eyes catalogued every detail. These were not merely coincidences of poor health. They were manifestations of heredity, the predictable results of repeated inbreeding. Yet, what chilled him most was the family's demeanor. None of the children showed surprise at a doctor's presence. None looked hopeful. Instead, they moved with the precision of people long conditioned to avoid mistakes. Fear hovered over them like smoke. At one point, Vogler asked a gentle question about the small graves behind the cabin. Liam froze, his lips parting as if to answer. Then Patrick's hand clamped firmly on the boy's shoulder, silencing him without a word. The look in the father's pale eyes carried not anger, but warning, a warning heavy with consequences. Liam lowered his head, silent once more. Bridget appeared next, emerging from behind a curtain. Her frame was skeletal, her shawl draped over trembling shoulders. She looked decades older than her age, her hair streaked with gray. When she tried to speak, Patrick cut her off sharply, as though even her words required his permission. Vogler noted the tremor in her hands, the haunted cast to her eyes. This was not the face of an ordinary settler's wife, but of a woman bearing unbearable secrets. As the doctor examined the children under the pretense of routine medical care, he heard sounds from behind the closed doors, muffled cries, rhythmic scraping, the faint rustle of pages turning. When he pressed Patrick about the locked rooms, the man smiled thinly. "Some things," he said, "belong only to family." Before leaving, Vogler insisted on stepping once more to the small graveyard. The air there was heavy, the silence suffocating. He knelt by one cross and brushed away dirt from its base. Beneath the surface, he found waxed cloth protruding, as though bodies had been sealed against decay. This was no hurried burial. It was preservation deliberate, methodical, perhaps for study. His journal that night was filled with frantic notes. The children bear unmistakable signs of hereditary degradation. The graves suggest systematic elimination, not random loss. The instruments within the cabin are too deliberate for ignorance. These people pursue breeding as one would with livestock, and yet they are human. How can a family turn itself into experimenters upon their own blood? But the most disturbing realization came when he observed Moira more closely. She was visibly pregnant. The timing midwinter conception meant no outsider could have been involved. In that isolated cabin, surrounded only by kin, the implications were unspeakable. The Kavanagh homestead was not a refuge from persecution. It was a laboratory of heredity, an experiment transplanted from Ireland to America, perfected in secrecy, and sustained through the sacrifice of children. Vogler left that day with more questions than answers. But one certainty pressed upon him: this family was not simply surviving, they were cultivating. The summer of 1859 brought with it an oppressive heat that turned the Ozark Valley into a stifling cauldron. Flies gathered thick in the air, drawn by the scent of livestock and something fouler, harder to name. It was on one such sweltering afternoon that Dr. Ernst Vogler was summoned urgently back to the Kavanagh homestead. The messenger trapper who rarely ventured near the valley delivered only a few words. Scrawled, in shaky hand, Kavanagh woman in bad labor. Something wrong beyond normal birth. Come quick. Vogler rode without pause. By the time he arrived, the air around the cabin was heavy with sweat, blood, and a faint sweetness that sent a shiver down his spine. Inside, he found Moira, not Bridget, lying upon the birthing bed. 17 years old, her face pale as linen, her body racked with the agony of labor. Her belly strained unnaturally wide, her cries hoarse from hours of effort. Patrick hovered nearby, his eyes cold, his commands precise, as though this was not his daughter in torment but a subject in an experiment. And then the infants came. Twins, but not separate. They were joined from chest to abdomen, their tiny torsos fused into one, their organs entangled, 2 heads, 2 sets of arms, 2 sets of legs, but one body from sternum to navel. Their skin was pale, their breath shallow. One twin cried weakly, the other only gasped, its eyes rolling in distress. The reaction of the family chilled Vogler more than the birth itself. Bridget moved swiftly, hands trembling yet practiced, as if she had done this before. Patrick barked orders in Gaelic, his voice stripped of panic, his tone clinical. Michael and Nora prepared cloth and instruments not for nurturing, but for containment. There was no prayer, no grief, only assessment. "Doctor," Patrick said, turning to Vogler, "can they be separated?" His question carried no hope, only calculation. Vogler examined them quickly, his physician's mind reeling. With the crude tools available, separation was impossible. They shared too much: their hearts, their circulation, their very survival bound together. To attempt surgery would mean certain death. Yet to let them live was to confront the family's darkest dilemma. As he worked, his eyes fell upon something beneath the birthing bed, a stack of leather-bound journals, their pages crowded with drawings and notes. He pulled one free and froze. Within, he found sketches of infants spanning decades, some malformed, some eerily uniform. Each labeled with meticulous detail: cleft palate, unfit; weak lungs, disposed; blue eyes, strong; notes written in both English and Gaelic; dates stretching back to 1790s Ireland. Each entry carried not grief, but judgment. Infants were catalogued like livestock. Their traits weighed against an invisible standard. Some pages showed crude diagrams of family trees, branches intertwining too closely, names repeating generation after generation. Beside them, notes on purity, strength of line, and acceptable unions. One entry chilled him to the core: conjoined births, evidence of strain, do not allow to continue. The date, 1832, the place, Kerry, Ireland. Nearly 3 decades earlier, the same anomaly had appeared and been recorded as if expected. When Bridget saw Vogler's discovery, her lips moved in a whisper that was half confession, half liturgy. The bloodline must be kept pure. Weakness must not spread. Mercy is in release. She spoke not like a woman grieving her grandchildren, but like a priest reciting doctrine. Vogler understood then this was not madness born of isolation. This was a creed passed down like scripture, polished by generations until murder wore the mask of divine duty. The twins whimpered, their tiny chests rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Vogler felt the weight of his oath to preserve life where he could. But Patrick's gaze bore into him, cold and commanding. "Tell us plainly," the patriarch demanded, "if they may be made whole. If not, you will step aside. We know what must be done." For hours, Vogler remained at the bedside, torn between science and horror. He bound the infants, kept them warm, and recorded their symptoms, but he knew the truth: they could not survive long. Their shared heart faltered under the strain, their cries weakening with each passing hour. That night, while the family slept fitfully, Vogler pored over the journals by lantern light. The deeper he read, the more the picture emerged: 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding, couched in religion and pseudoscience. The Kavanaghs had convinced themselves they were crafting a superior lineage. They measured children not by soul or spirit, but by jawlines, eye color, and symmetry. Those who failed were returned to God. Those who survived bore the weight of continuing the cycle. The pages documented not accidents, but a program. What the Church had condemned in Ireland, the Kavanaghs had resurrected in America. And here, in the Ozarks, with no parish priest to intervene, their work had grown darker, more methodical, unchecked by law or conscience. As dawn broke, the cries of the twins faded into silence. Their fused chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. Vogler closed their eyes with trembling hands. But for the Kavanaghs, there were no tears. Patrick only muttered, "The Lord takes the weak. We will try again." The doctor realized, with mounting dread, that what he had witnessed was not the end of something, but the continuation of a design centuries in the making. The death of the conjoined twins might have ended in quiet burial, as with the others before them, had Dr. Ernst Vogler not confronted Patrick Kavanagh directly. The family was weary, their eyes hollow from another failed birth. Yet there was no grief in the cabin, only silence, calculation, and a sense of grim routine. For Vogler, it was unbearable. He waited until dusk, when the younger children had retreated behind curtains and Bridget lay slumped in a corner, whispering half-prayers under her breath. Patrick stood at the table, the journals spread before him, his pale fingers tracing diagrams of bones and measurements as though they were scripture. "Patrick," Vogler began, his voice steady, "this is not medicine. It is butchery disguised as faith. You are not purifying your line, you are destroying it." Patrick lifted his gaze slowly, and in that moment, Vogler saw the full weight of conviction in the man's eyes. "Destroying," he repeated softly, almost amused. "Doctor, you do not understand. You see only the failures, the graves. But those are necessary sacrifices. Look at the ones who live: Michael, Moira, Nora. Do you not see their strength, their brilliance? They are the fruit of discipline, of purpose, of blood untainted by weakness." Vogler's jaw tightened. "I see a young woman forced into childbirth before she is grown. I see a boy twisted by deformity. I see fear in their eyes, not strength. You are breeding suffering into your own flesh." Patrick's hand slammed down on the journal. "No, you speak as a foreigner who cannot grasp what it means to preserve a people. In Ireland we were broken by famine, by English cruelty, by the weakness of those who married into common stock. My grandfather taught us to survive. We must control what God gave us. The English breed horses better than we breed men. Why should that be? Are we not children of God as well? Should we not strive for perfection?" The argument cut deep into Vogler's own troubled past. He, too, had once argued in European halls of medicine that heredity shaped destiny, that blood carried both brilliance and disease. But where he had spoken of theory, Patrick practiced ritual murder. Vogler felt the chill of seeing his own abandoned ideas twisted into something monstrous. "You speak of perfection," Vogler said quietly, Yet all I see is decay. Your hair is white, though you are not yet 50. Your children falter beneath the weight of your creed. This is not God's will. This is man's arrogance." Patrick's face hardened. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the doctor. "Do not speak to me of arrogance, Herr Vogler. I know of your scandal in Vienna. I know you fled because your colleagues called you mad, because you dared to say what they feared, that humanity could be shaped like clay. Do you deny it? Do you not see yourself in me?" The words struck like a blade. Vogler's past was a wound he never spoke of. Yet, somehow, Patrick had uncovered it. Perhaps through rumor, perhaps through shared obsession. For a moment, the physician faltered. Was there truth in Patrick's claim? Had he not once believed that careful control of reproduction could better mankind? And if so, was Patrick not merely the grotesque mirror of his own ambition? The silence stretched. Finally, Vogler drew a slow breath. "Perhaps I once believed as you do. But belief does not make murder righteous. These children, your children, are not experiments. They are lives. And you have turned them into ledger entries." Patrick's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then tell me, doctor, what would you have me do? Let the weak ones live, watch them suffer, crippled, ridiculed, cast out, better to end it quickly, mercifully. That is love. Vogler. The only love that matters." The doctor felt the walls of the cabin press in around him. He looked at Bridget, her eyes glassy with exhaustion and terror. He looked at Michael, trembling in the doorway, lips moving as though trying to speak but too afraid. And he realized the truth: the family was as much prisoner to Patrick's creed as executioners of it. In that moment, Vogler faced a choice. He could step aside, allowing the cycle to continue, rationalizing that frontier law could never stop what was hidden in such isolation. Or he could intervene, risk exposing himself, and perhaps condemn the family and himself to ruin. He drew himself upright, his voice iron. "If you harm another child, Patrick, I will bring the law down upon you. If you speak of purity again, I will write every word in the journals of science. Your name will not be remembered as a savior of bloodlines, but as a murderer of innocence." The patriarch's face twitched, a crack in his armor. For a fleeting instant, doubt flickered in his pale eyes. Then he turned away, his voice low and cold. "You are too late, doctor. The blood has already been set. What remains is only to finish what our fathers began." That night, as Vogler lay awake in the cabin's oppressive air, he knew the confrontation had changed nothing. The Kavanagh creed ran deeper than reason, deeper than fear. It was doctrine etched into their very marrow. But he also knew this: the next birth, the next selection, would either break the family or expose them to the world. The line between science, faith, and madness had blurred beyond recognition, and soon it would collapse entirely. The conjoined twins lived only 3 days. Their fused chest struggled against itself, one heart straining to serve 2 fragile bodies. Vogler did all he could, wrapping them in swaddling, keeping the air warm, spooning drops of milk to their lips. But each hour their cries weakened, their breaths shorter, until at last, before dawn, silence filled the cabin. Patrick ordered them buried before the sun rose. Michael dug the grave mechanically, his hands blistered, his face pale. Moira, the mother, sat slumped on the floor, eyes vacant, lips moving silently as if reciting a prayer no one else could hear. Nora wept in silence, the sound of it quickly silenced by her father's glare. Liam stared, unblinking, at the small bundle being lowered into the earth. But this burial was different. Vogler was there, watching, recording. And this time he vowed the graves would not remain hidden. After the funeral, Vogler confronted Patrick once more, this time with open threat. "You may silence your wife, your children, even the infants you cast into the earth, but you will not silence me. I am the territorial physician. If you continue, the marshals will come. Your graves will be counted. Your journals read aloud in court. And the world will know what you have done." The patriarch's hands trembled, though his jaw stayed firm. "You bring ruin on us all, doctor. You cannot understand we carry both greatness and curse. Without purity, we are nothing." Yet, for the first time, Vogler saw fear in his eyes. Word spread quickly once Vogler returned to Springfield. He did not reveal every detail of the incest, the ritual selection, but he reported enough an unnatural number of infant deaths, suspicious graves, and journals documenting deliberate infanticide. The local sheriff, hesitant at first, rode into the valley with 2 deputies. Behind the cabin they found 11 marked graves, and when the soil was disturbed, they uncovered remains wrapped in oilcloth, preserved almost as specimens. The law could no longer look away. Patrick and Bridget were taken into custody, their children removed under guard. Michael broke down under questioning, stuttering confessions of how he had been forced to help bury siblings since the age of 12. Moira, gaunt and traumatized, admitted the twins were not her first lost infants. Nora refused to speak at all, and Liam, trembling, whispered to one deputy, "Father said God didn't want them, but I don't think it was God." The legal proceedings that followed were chaotic. No precedent existed in the frontier courts for crimes spanning generations, wrapped in ritual, justified by twisted interpretations of scripture and pseudoscience. Patrick argued that he was carrying out God's will, that ending the lives of the weak was mercy. Bridget broke under questioning, collapsing into sobs, her mind fractured from years of complicity. Before the trial concluded, fate rendered its own judgment. Patrick suffered a stroke in his cell, dying within days. Bridget, pregnant once more, miscarried violently and followed him soon after. Both deaths were recorded simply as natural causes, but to those who knew, it seemed more like the bloodline collapsing under its own poisoned weight. The children were dispersed, Michael institutionalized after a mental breakdown. Moira sent to relatives who could scarcely comprehend her trauma. Nora placed under the care of nuns, and Liam lost to history after escaping custody. His fate remains unknown. Some saying he wandered into the wilderness, others that he was taken in by strangers and stripped of his name. As for Dr. Vogler, he documented everything. His clinical notes became some of the earliest American records linking close intermarriage with congenital deformities and psychological collapse. In public journals, he wrote cautiously of the dangers of hereditary isolation. In his private diary, however, he recorded the truth in stark detail. The Kavanagh family practiced eugenics before the word existed. They called their own children in pursuit of an ideal that brought only ruin. Their graves stand not as tragedy, but as warning. The cabin was abandoned. Locals avoided the valley, whispering of chants that lingered in the wind, of shadows near the graveyard at dusk. The small crosses, weathered and leaning, remained for decades a mute testimony to the horrors concealed within frontier isolation. Eventually, the forest reclaimed the land, but those who knew never forgot. In time, other cases surfaced across America: isolated families, hidden valleys, whispers of blood purity and sacred unions. None were ever proven to the same degree as the Kavanaghs. Yet the Ozark graves stood as proof that even in the so-called civilized century, the hunger for control over life and blood could drive a family to murder its own flesh in the name of perfection. Dr. Vogler's notes ended with a question that still haunts historians. How many others, how many families, hidden in forests and mountains, carried the same creed across oceans, and how many graves remain unmarked, their secrets rotting beneath the soil of America? The Kavanagh story was not simply one family's madness. It was a glimpse into humanity's darkest ambition to shape life itself, and in doing so, to sacrifice everything that makes us human.